let's move on to our next topic of the day then. Kit, a week or so ago, you wrote an editorial for Redaction about the state of transphobia in the British establishment. This was inspired by a defeated amendment to that contentious police crime and sentencing bill that's currently being debated in the UK Parliament. There's plenty of objectionable measures in this bill. There's a whole topic for a whole podcast there in due course, but one objection that was proposed in the House of Lords was that prisoners would be treated along the lines of the sex they were assigned at birth when being incarcerated. Transphobia is rife in the UK, let's make no mistake. Reported hate crimes against trans people have surged in the nation over the past few years, and yet still many members of the British commentariat are insisting on demonising the trans community. Kit, what did you discover while researching this editorial?
Well, I think the first thing is when you are speaking about trans people being put into prisons according to their sex that they were assigned at birth, one of the justifications that was put forward for this in the House of Lords was that it was to protect women in women's prisons. And the implicit argument in there is that trans women in a women's prison would constitute a threat to the women who were being incarcerated there. And I think this is a problem because there is an assumption in that the trans people that are being kept there are somehow more capable of sexual violence, basically. There's an assumption that that will be why they're imprisoned in the first place, if that makes sense, even though there's just a myriad and literally any other reason that someone could be incarcerated for, you know, more and less serious crimes. There seems to be some kind of implicit assumption that that would be what it was if it was a trans person that was in prison, which is a huge problem. You get similar kind of demonization about people being characterized as like sexual predators and perverts and unnatural threats to children, all that kind of horrible rhetoric. This has previously been deployed against other marginalized groups. It's been deployed against gay and bisexual men, for example, who have previously in the past been painted as implicitly predatory just by the nature of who they are, right? This is the first big problem, I think, is the assumption that if a trans person is in prison, it's because of a sex-related crime, which is of course not true. It's a complete fallacy. The second thing is that it completely misunderstands that trans people are far more likely to be a victim of sexual violence than they are to be a perpetrator of it as well, or a victim of violence, or any kind of violence, really, and than they are to be a perpetrator of it. So what these kind of measures would or could result in if they had actually gone through would be placing people in a lot of danger. You can imagine being a female presenting trans person in a male prison. I mean, that's not going to be a very welcoming or supportive environment, is it really?
Can I jump in and clarify there that Pink News reported when covering this amendment that if the amendment had passed, it would have, or at least could have, resulted in separate accommodation specifically for trans prisoners. So it might not have necessarily resulted in trans women going into men's prisons, but you know, the point still stands when we're talking more broadly about transphobia, of course.
Definitely. I think even just having a kind of separate prison for trans people is also a problem, because at what point do you start defining someone as falling into that category? Okay, is it only when someone has, for example, started transitioning that you would put them into that category? Or is it someone who's currently experiencing gender dysphoria but hasn't necessarily started any kind of hormone replacement therapy or other gender reassignment procedures that you can have, right? At what point do you start to think, well, maybe this person should be in here? On the other hand as well, it's also, not on the other hand, as well, it's also I think, quite a dangerous thing to be putting people into a completely separate space because of the way that they're identifying and because of the way that they're the relationship that they have with their own gender and their identity, especially when it could just as easily be sorted by having people in the prison that they are identifying with in terms of their gender identity, right? I think it's just, it was put forward as a way of perhaps alleviating that, but in that there may even be a tacit acknowledgement that maybe it wouldn't be a good idea to have trans people in the same prisons, right? In the prison that they're assigned for the gender that they were assigned at birth, right? There's an acknowledgement there that maybe this is dangerous, maybe this isn't safe. Aside from all the other stuff of at what point do we define that someone is trans, and at what point does this kind of stop as well? Do you then start saying, well, we can't possibly have gay people in prisons because they might constitute a threat to other prisoners? It's pandering to a kind of fear. It's pandering to a transphobia, which I think is often a kind of to coin a term, a gateway phobia into other very unpleasant things as well.
Yes, I often find that if you look at the parallels between the moral panic, the transphobic moral panic we see today, and the homophobic and biphobic moral panic we saw back in the 80s, it raises very serious questions about the historical literacy of the so-called gender critical crowd when you consider those staggering parallels.
Well, I mean, there's two examples of this that I can give. The first one was a TikTok creator who did an experiment on the app with the algorithm. And this creator, she made a new account and then would only interact. So the way the algorithm works, when you interact with a video, it shows you more videos like that. That's kind of it, basically. It says, if you like this, you might also like this. And she only interacted with content that was transphobic content or labeled itself as gender critical content. And it took her, I think the experiment said it took her about 2 days to end up on the side of TikTok that pushes ideologies like white supremacist ideologies, basically. So it's kind of, the app's almost saying like, oh, you like this content, you might also like this content. This took about, it did not take long to kind of arrive on that side of TikTok, just interacting with those kind of transphobic videos, with those videos labeling themselves gender critical. I think that's a really good example of just how social media can kind of reinforce that and create that kind of echo chamber that pushes people who might otherwise hold quite liberal views on lots of other different issues, for example, racism, for example, sexism, for example, homophobia, and then push a lot of those other ideas in there just because of this one thing that someone who might not be like a sort of die-hard gender critical person, but just has some questions, basically. I think that's very dangerous. The second one
is similar that we saw, sorry, just to jump in there. Again, that's not a new story. We saw that about this time 7 years ago, roughly 2015-ish, at a time when you had that whole, anyone who's very online like me will remember the whole anti-SJW backlash, and this whole cohort of quote unquote anti-SJW YouTubers, people like Sargon of Akkad. Yes, a grown man who goes on the internet and actually calls himself Sargon of Akkad. People like that who were promoting these sort of anti-SJW talking points, that, you had some liberally minded people who might find, what might be called the quote unquote politically correct, what we today call woke, I guess, sides of the left more unappealing. And then slowly that content becomes more and more radical, to the point at which the algorithms are pointing you, like you say, directly towards white supremacy and alt-right ideologies.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think it's very disturbing that we're seeing a similar thing happening with transphobic content on these platforms now as well. I think the second thing as well is that the parallels, like you mentioned, that anti-trans activists have with a lot of anti-gay and anti-bi activists that we've seen in the 1980s and 1990s as well, definitely.